if you have an acute sense of calling from God, if you are a banker or if you work in management in a retail company, whatever it may be, if you understand that calling to be a calling from God for the common good, a calling from God for the flourishing of all people, that will form and shape your behaviours. If you think, as the certain parts of sort of pietistic evangelicalism do, that the purpose of the wealthy lawyer is to earn more money to pay for more ministers at the front of church, then you have destroyed the ethics of the Christian lawyer.
Welcome to the Acton Line podcast, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. In this episode, Dan Churchwell, Acton's Director of Program Outreach, sits down with Dr. Richard Turnbull, the Director for the Center for Enterprise Markets and Ethics, to discuss how banks and credit unions develop a culture of savings, independence, and poverty prevention. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as previous episodes on our website at acton.org/podcast. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Welcome to Acton Line. My name is Dan Churchwell, Director of Program Outreach here at Acton. Today we have the pleasure of talking with Reverend Dr. Richard Turnbull, who is the director of the Center for Enterprise, Markets and Ethics in the UK. He's also the chairman of the trustees of the Acton Institute, and he holds degrees in economics and accounting and spent over 8 years as a chartered accountant with Ernst & Young. Dr. Turnbull also holds a first-class honors degree in theology and a PhD in theology from the University of Durham, and he was ordained into the Church of England in 1994 and served in a pastoral role for 10 years. From 2005 to 2012, he was the principal of Wycliffe Hall, Oxford. He's authored several books, including an acclaimed biography of Lord Shaftesbury. He serves as a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a visiting professor at St. Mary's University. Welcome.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, we invited you to speak. You've written many articles for our online different venues of our online work, and I really appreciate that. You've also spoken for us several times as well, so it's good to have you back. We asked you to come and speak on a topic, savings and poverty, how savings banks and credit unions help prevent poverty. Can you just give us a basic rundown of why is savings and thrift and these bank accounts, why is that an interesting topic? What drew you to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, you see, the situation has changed completely in most of our lifetimes. And for most of us, we're used to buy now, pay later. We're used to debt not being seemingly a problem at all, low interest rates and so on and so forth. And we're also used to hearing stories about whether it's government interventions in social welfare or whether it's people struggling to make ends meet. And it seemed to me that there's something missing. And it seems to me that what was missing was that sort of character formation that leads to self-help, leads to prudence, leads to independence. And it struck me that the principle of saving represented the development of those crucial characteristics. So I got to work and did some investigations in my main area of expertise in the 19th century, church history, which is really where my expertise lies. And I have for many years been digging out many of the stories of these societies of civil society, institutions of civil society, associations, mutual societies, friendly societies, banking institutions. And I came to see that what these organisations did was actually confer dignity on ordinary people by encouraging them to save. And it meant they could save for a rainy day, they could save in order to aspire to more and new things. And it wasn't just that everything was served up on a plate.
So now what era are you primarily, researching? Is this the 18th century? Is this 19th? What?
So mostly the 19th century. Okay. I mean, and it was here that you had these societies and organizations and institutions really expanding and really making a difference in local communities. And, certainly in England, there are only about 5 banks. There's no one you can ever talk to because they never answer the phone. Right. They have no interest in who you are or where you live. They just want to, regurgitate what their latest interest rates are, almost entirely, of course, in their favour. And what these smaller financial institutions did was bring the opportunity of saving to local communities, and they were often formed in towns and cities, certainly across England and I think also across America as well. Sure. And they would be run by local people. They would have independence. They would be places where people knew each other, so you would know the financial institution you were dealing with. And they would encourage people to start saving even very small amounts. Yeah. And it sort of formed and shaped the character of the individual.
Well, I grew up using a federal credit union and those kinds of things. And in fact, I remember just last year my father lamenting that his loan officer was retiring. Yeah, so for 30 years, he had the same officer at the bank that he could go in and talk to, and she was fantastic, and he lamented
absolutely
that she was retiring.
And of course, she knew him.
Yeah.
So she knew his history. She knew his story. She knew the challenges. She knew the times when he had money coming in and the times when he needed, taking loans for houses or whatever it was. It was a personal, relational.
It really was.
Situation.
So contextually then, I mean, obviously our average listener would know you run to the bank. Most people can do mobile banking now, right?
Sure.
It's all on the phones. But when you do need to run to the bank, everybody has a little bit of a visual on that. What would it look like in the 19th century? I mean, when people – because obviously paychecks probably weren't as rate – or give us a little context.
Well, I think the best example is the idea of the school. So the schools which were established for the poor by people like Lord Shaftesbury, and they would be established to deal with many of the poorer people in society, to give them the opportunity for education. And there are pictures you can look at of these schools, and there are archive material and journals you can read. But here's the thing. It wasn't just a school. There would be 2 other, in particular, crucial characteristics to these schools, often run by churches and volunteer Christian associations, Christian societies. They would usually employ someone who would teach the children a trade, tailors, shoemakers. Those were very common trades, in order to provide them with some opportunity for development in life. And equally, they would have a bank. And so you have this school where you would have the teaching of a trade, teaching the children to read and to write, and teaching them the scriptures and teaching them the faith, and a bank where they would be encouraged to save. All of those 3 things together is a much more holistic view than we have today, and formed their sort of character and gave them the opportunity to progress.
Yeah, that is fascinating. What would they – is this what you were referencing in your lecture, like the penny bank?
Yes.
Is that what,
so the penny bank, I mean, it's a strange name, isn't it? It's all a bit Victorian in that sense. But the idea of the penny bank was that even some of the more usual savings banks had a minimum deposit. Mm-hmm. But if you are poorer, you might not be able to afford that minimum deposit. And so they developed this idea of the penny bank, where literally they would accept the deposit of a penny. But doing that every week, and you begin to build up a balance. And they would often have a relationship with a savings bank in the town, where they would then put their deposits, accumulated deposits, on deposit.
And was this fairly widespread?
It was.
Okay.
Yes, it was very widespread. I mean, the first ones actually developed in Scotland, but very quickly spread across England, particularly in the towns and cities, where you had large numbers of people coming in for work, sometimes issues of employment and wages, issues of illness, and therefore encouraging people to take responsibility.
Now, Is it fair? Maybe not. Is this an innovation, if you will, during the Industrial Revolution? I mean, because the people coming into the towns, children needing, the poor kids needing labor, and work.
Sure.
Was that interconnected at this period?
It was, and I suppose what happened was, before the big movements of population that you had with the Industrial Revolution, most people living in rural areas, in villages, which were much smaller. It might be 30 people, might be 50 people. And basically everybody looked after each other. Yeah. And if somebody was in need, they would be provided for. The problem was when you had these large-scale movements into the city where you would have tens of thousands of people in a very small area. The question was, how are you going to bring those principles into those urban situations and urban settings?
And you mentioned virtue multiple times too in the lecture, which will be available online, and we'll put a link in the show notes to that. Virtue, the idea of virtue and institutions, like it was very important to kind of link the two. Why is savings a virtue?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah. Well, saving is a virtue because it's about taking responsibility for your own development and future, taking responsibility for your own welfare and your family's welfare. Family also very important part of this equation. It enables you to deal with the shocks to the system when you sometimes need to draw on the savings you put aside for a rainy day, or if something has gone wrong in your life, the ability to do that and to care for your family. And saving encourages you to view that as your prime responsibility. And Dan, the problem is we today just fall into this trap, really, of thinking the responsibility is somebody else's. The responsibility is the state's, or the responsibility is, and it's never my fault anyway. And actually what saving does is it creates character. It allows you to develop prudence. It allows you to develop that idea that you have responsibilities and personal responsibility for yourself and your family. And
I think you mentioned as well that it was like a future orient, because they were saving up. I think you mentioned like a stove, or they would be saving up for something larger, and it would prevent you from spending your money right away if you had a goal.
Yes. Well, and I mean, isn't that true for us? I don't know about you, but I remember as a kid, I'd be saving my money in order for something that I wanted. But I also remember my family, who were not a particularly well-off or wealthy family. If there were things that my parents felt we needed to improve our life as a family, they saved in order to buy. They didn't just go and take debt in order to buy.
Kind of a delayed gratification of some kind.
It encourages you to be patient, encourages you not to expect things immediately, it encourages you to work for the return.
So, maybe the flip side of that, though, is, I could flip out, my credit card and just buy it, right now, and if somebody is, or debit, let's say debit card, but credit card, if credit card is actual debt, right? And do you think the invention of the credit card has limited that or acted like a retardant to that idea of virtue?
I think it links to the idea of financial education. And I think, I use a credit card like everyone else does. And I think if you have got that financial education that encourages you to understand what you're doing when you use your credit card, that's fine. But it is interesting that even today, a lot of debt management agencies or debt management societies who are seeking to help people who have got into debt, one of the first pieces of advice is to cut up the credit card. Yeah. So whether you spend it on a credit card, a debit card, or in cash, you have to understand that you are spending.
It's almost like the fundamentals of money,
exactly.
How money works
exactly.
out. Yeah.
And I don't know about the US, but certainly in the UK, if you talk to my own children, we have 4 children, and they're all highly critical of the sort of stuff they received in schooling about citizenship and about life together in society. It was all woke stuff. And they say to me today, why weren't we taught how to budget? Why weren't we taught how financial products worked? That's what we need to do.
Yeah, and there are some practical things that have been or have gone by the wayside in that are very pivotal to societal health. Do you think, you mentioned a lot institutions and virtues. Is it even – sometimes I think when I hear – and the history is very clear, right? You do a great job. But is it even possible to have – I mean, when you get Citibank, from the banking centers here, Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, they're all over, but a lot of them are hyper segmented, but they're far away. Yeah. And like you said, you get a call center. Yeah. I was on a call center the other day. It was a bill I was paying for a doctor's appointment, and their billing was in the Philippines.
Yes.
And I literally called the Philippines. Yeah, I didn't know it. It was an American number, but you call it. Connects to the Philippines. And then the person I got on the phone said, oh, there's only one person in our office that handles this account, and they're out. But there's absolutely – I mean, we want to talk about distance, right? They don't know – it's really hard to get clear answers, et cetera. So is it even possible, those concepts of virtue, the concepts of institutions, local communities, knowing one another, the trust that engenders? I mean – Is there a nostalgia there? I mean, we look back and say that was but is it even possible?
No. Sure. Sure, one of the dangers always is nostalgia or a romanticism of what took place in the past. And clearly you can't just reinvent and you can't just copy what has taken place in the past. My point really is that the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction, and maybe we need both. I want to be able to bank on my phone. I want to be able to sort of pay my bills on my online account. I want to be able to do things online quick and easy too. Mm-hmm. My point is that by losing the other side of the equation, the locality, the relationships, the community, we lose something significant. So I want to bring back some of those principles. I don't just want to sort of, pretend you can reinvent what happened in the 19th century. But I think we've become so dependent on big, global, national, governmental. Actually, we need to return some responsibility to our local communities. Mm-hmm. And if we did that, I think you would see an outpouring of philanthropy, you would see an outpouring of responsibility, and an outpouring of people really getting stuck in their local communities.
Well, like I said earlier, we will put a link in the show notes. It was a fascinating talk. So if you want to hear more, please go and watch the YouTube lecture of Dr. Turnbull. But I want to shift a little bit, just briefly. When I read your bio, every time I read your bio, and I'm like, wow, you have such an interdisciplinary background. You have business, you have a degree in theology, you have obviously management experience through both nonprofits and just through your clergy work. I mean, give us a sense of your journey, through those different things.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Looking back, you can see when you look back how God has guided you in different ways over your life. You're not always aware of it at the actual time. And I started out as a young guy in my 20s, going to work in the City of London. I came from a very normal, ordinary, humble background, actually in a mining district in the north of England. And I was the first member of my family ever to go to university.
Oh, wow.
And I headed off to university, I studied economics, and I wanted to go and work in the City of London. And I didn't know how to do that. I had no contacts. I didn't know what to do. So ended up training as an accountant. But I'd become a Christian. I became a Christian at the age of 21. And I was forever asking that question of how does my faith and what I've studied as economics relate to each other? And there were a number of answers available that I found very unsatisfactory. Usually they were very corporatist answers, or they were very sort of socialist answers, if one's blunt about it. And I wanted something more deeper. I wanted something more of a discussion around values and purpose and so on. And it was really, life went on from there. And then when I came to study theology, I was able to use that ability, if you like, or that knowledge to apply more precisely some of that thinking into the economic sector. And really, I came out, interdisciplinary work in the academic sector is quite honestly frowned upon.
Yeah, right.
I mean, they kind of, marginally tolerate it, but you're kind of, you're not loved by anybody. You're not pure enough for any
For
group.
sure.
But to me, I think the wonder of it is, hey, can we bring together our economic thinking, our theological thinking, our philosophical thinking, in order to build a vision for a society that is built on, God's vision for all of these disciplines. And I think compartmentalization, where it all gets put into silos, is terribly, terribly disastrous. So if I could just carry on a moment or two, economics is a good example of that. So when I studied economics, it was at least some discussion took place over purpose. Now, economics in the academic world is primarily mathematical.
Math, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's just
econometrics.
it's just econometrics. And, well, if the equation says X, it's X. But what about the purpose behind X? That's what I want to ask.
No, that's great. And you've written for us and in other venues and for the Center for Enterprise Markets and Ethics. I mean, you're helping to run a center that deals with this as well, but you've written articles for us on the purpose of work, vocation, kind of your calling in that. Did those questions come up when you took your degrees in theology, and then you became, you worked for in the Church of England as an ordained minister? Did those questions come up in lay people? I mean, were you able to use that ability and that knowledge in your practical ministry?
Yes. I remember when I was the pastor of a church, I remember making an announcement at the front of church that I was going to hold a meeting the following 2 weeks hence for anyone involved in business who wanted to come and discuss the issues that they faced in business. And I went home and I said to my wife, I completely messed up giving out that notice. I wasn't clear. I wasn't clear about purpose. I garbled it. It's going to be a disaster. More people turned out to that meeting than any other church meeting I'd ever had. Why? Because they said to me, for the first time, they heard from the front of the church a minister who understood some of the dilemmas that they faced on a daily basis. What they normally heard, not from me, but from a lot of churches, was simply business being dirty, business being nasty, business being horrible. Whereas I think God's purpose in business is to help people to flourish and so on.
Yeah, and I had the ability to teach in a business school in the Pacific Northwest, and I taught business and social ethics. And for 3 years I was able to loved it, absolutely fell in love with teaching then. And when you'd go around the community, what do you do? And I'm like, I work for this university. What do you teach? Business ethics. And like, isn't that an oxymoron? And obviously that you see, I mean, they're almost not daily. That's probably a little much, but weekly, some sort of business malfeasance or what do you think gives people that? You said they struggle with, or you were taught that business is inherently dirty, or you just can't do good in business. Why do you think that exists?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a disastrous consequence of two things, really. Firstly, certainly in the UK, the tendency of church leaders to be more socialist and effectively have a corporatist mentality, and therefore lose sight of God's purposes for the common kingdom, if you like. And actually, even in the world that I come from, which was a world of evangelicalism and so on, the tendency in that world to so divide the spiritual from the secular, that the secular is viewed as evil and dirty. But if the secular, so-called, is evil and dirty, then we're saying that God is condemning where we spend most of our life as meaningless. Well, I don't believe that God does that. I believe God has purpose and intent behind all of those things.
Yeah. And it's also on the flip side, too, you can hyper-spiritualize. And I think you even wrote in one of your articles, I think you used the term pietistic.
Yes.
That if you hyper-spiritualize the other side,
yes,
that it does obviously minimize just obviously, if it's hyper spiritual to work as a missionary or a Christian school teacher or a pastoral ministry, something like that is just inherently better.
Yes, but what about a banker?
Right.
What about or any other example you'd care to use? And that's why vocation is so important, because vocation is the beginning of ethics. If you have an acute sense of calling from God, if you are a banker or if you work in management in a retail company, whatever it may be, if you understand that calling to be a calling from God for the common good, a calling from God for the flourishing of all people, that will form and shape your behaviours. If you think, as certain parts of sort of pietistic evangelicalism do, that the purpose of the wealthy lawyer is to earn more money to pay for more ministers at the front of church,
right,
then you have destroyed the ethics of the Christian lawyer.
That's a good way of putting it too. Yeah, and if you're around, Acton speaks to these as well. We've written or sponsored books, on these topics, and we have conferences that speak to these topics. So it's very near and dear to our mission as well. These underlying vocational ideas, and to get them right, or to at least think about them in the right ways, because they are complex, right?
Sure. I
mean, very in the modern world, how business or free enterprise or capitalism, however different people express it. Let's segue though. Let's use this as a jumping off point to talk about those principles, what you just laid down, though, in light of what's just happened. COVID broke a lot of things. Work from home. We could have a whole litany of what it seemed the last 2 years has done to our thinking in a lot of these areas. And just before COVID, David Graeber, an author, he wrote a lot about debt, and he's an anarchist, and he helped with the Occupy Wall Street. Like, he coined part of that term, Occupy Wall Street. So he's not a friend of free markets or anything like that, but he was prescient in some of his thoughts, and I think I gained a lot of respect for him through reading some of his work, even though he is kind of a radical and an anarchist. But one of them, his book was on debt, and then the second book was on jobs, and I'll just abbreviate it here. It's called BS Jobs. And he talked a lot about the modern economy, and again, this was right, pre-COVID, is built on a whole layer of jobs that are almost unnecessary. Like they've created largely white collar, some lawyers. I mean, he just lists a whole litany of jobs that seem, the way he presents, meaningless. Like they're just paper pushers. Like if that person, think of the movie Office Space, or the show, which came from the UK, The Office. I don't know if you ever watched that when it was popular in the UK, but we in America, hugely popular show. It seems like a lot of work is just merely mundane or meaningless. What do you sense of the modern vibe of?
Yeah. Well, I understand that, and I take what he said, and it's always important to read people you disagree with.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'll never understand why people
Absolutely.
are saying things different from what you think. Dan, I'm sure I've always had the problem. I've never understood why anyone thought anything different from what I think.
Yes.
Surely, no, it's always important, isn't it, to engage with those who think differently. But I think I would want to challenge, to some degree, some of those presumptions. I think part of our job as Christians who understand that God has created this world, God has given us a mandate to work. It is something that all people are to do as part of their flourishing and so on. I think one of the challenges is helping everybody to see their job as a thing of beauty. Helping everybody to see their job as creative, helping everybody to see their job as part of that wider picture. Now, you might say, that's all naive, that's all sort of, that doesn't help the people who are doing routine jobs. Well, we're all different. Everybody's different. We need different types of job in an economy. Although generally I'm in favour of a high-skilled economy, you still need entry-level jobs. You need to provide ways in and ways up. And obviously, if you believe in the dignity of the human individual, as we do as Christians, there are important things to learn about how work is designed and how work is discharged and so on. But I still want to encourage the person who cleans the office, or the person who cleans the factory, or the person who cleans the restrooms in the factory to see their job as having dignity, as having purpose, and contributing to human flourishing.
Yeah, and I wonder if they would say, do you think about absolutely? I mean, it is important, but that seems that we're back to like a personalist or that's a very individualist way of thinking. And are there, I think if, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but Graeber or others would say, but there are structure, you can individually have an attitude that is positive and go towards working and say, I'm doing this for the glory of God, or, whatever language you want to use. But the concept of is it possible, in your opinion, that there are structural ills that even though that person has that individual attitude, the actual work actually is damaging?
Well, I think I'm a yes and a no on that, in that I don't think I'd want to say there are no structural issues. I think that's probably a bit naive to think there are no structural issues. But I also wonder whether structural issues are sometimes used as an excuse. And therefore, actually what we need to do is encourage all businesses or companies, all structures and manners of working as affirming the dignity of their employees and affirming the dignity of their individuals at every level. So, yes, sure, but what structures are we talking about? Are we talking about, well, what about, the structure of regulation or government? Maybe we should have a little bit less of those things. Yeah. It's often used as an excuse, I think, to say there are structural problems. And I think structural problems can be overcome by a positive outlook and a positive attitude. I mean, that may be a bit naive, but that's sort of,
Sure. Another thing we're post-COVID now thinking through in America, it's called the Great Resignation, and I don't know if it's the same in the UK or not, but there's been a large percentage of people obviously that lost jobs through the COVID upheaval, but then people that are willingly changing jobs and kind of the churn of the job market, regardless of inflation or, minimum wage issues. I mean, there's a lot of churn. A lot of that is now coming out statistically. It's like below white collar. There is some churn in white collar, but it's less so as the data becomes more clear. But is it the same in the UK, or what are your thoughts on, this? It seems like something broke about work.
Yes, you're right. And it is the same in the UK.
Okay.
And the same terminology is
it is.
used
Okay.
in terms of the Great Resignation and so on. Interestingly, they've just announced the latest unemployment figures in the UK, the lowest for decades. So there's very low unemployment. And so the question you've got to ask is, what's going on then in this churn? And one way of looking at it, I don't necessarily accept this in its entirety, but one way of looking at it is that because of the work from home emphasis in COVID and because of the need for a slightly different outlook, I suppose, to make things happen, people have reassessed what's important. Mm-hmm. They've reassessed how to gain satisfaction from
work-life balance.
Exactly. That was the word I was looking for. Work-life balance and the satisfaction across a whole range of things. I accept that, but I'm a little sceptical. And the reason I'm a little sceptical is that it's all very well for people like me and for people like you, who most of our lives have had elements of flexibility. And that's a good thing.
Sure.
I'm in favour of flexibilities, and I sometimes work from home, I sometimes work from office, I'm sometimes out and about. But I have a privilege to do that. And many of the people you were talking about earlier in the more mundane and routine jobs don't have that privilege to be able to do that. Yeah. And so I'm slightly sceptical about whether we're having a little bit of, this could be very controversial, middle class sort of, kind of laziness going on. And actually, the people who've been working at home kind of think, it's quite like knocking off at 4:00.
Right.
And quite like not, I won't bother doing anything on Friday afternoons or Monday mornings. And I think that's a dangerous thing. And I think it's dangerous for creativity, for innovation, and all of those things.
And did you say in the UK there's some differences in the civil servants? They're doing some studies, or it's seeming to affect service? Is that right?
So obviously every sector is affected by this whole change of culture and are dealing with it in different ways. And certainly, and I'm more than relaxed about this. Certainly, there's been an increase in flexibility, and that's a good thing, I'm sure. But by and large, I would say the private sector in the UK is returning to the office. Maybe with more flexibility, absolutely, but certainly an expectation that you'd be in the office on a regular basis and the majority of your time during the week.
Okay.
And of course, the advantage of that is it's the conversations you have in the office that spark the creativity. It's the mentoring and the training can only take place when two people are actually together. It doesn't work over Zoom.
Yeah. Or at least it's highly different.
Yes.
It's very different. Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is that in many aspects of our government service, there seems to be a permanent stay-at-home attitude from the civil servants.
Okay.
And that's causing problems in service delivery, although they deny it, but there appears to be a correlation. And it's also causing a problem in the delivery of government services, in that the government of the day, the ministers, the civil servants who are meant to be doing the job aren't there. And it does leave me rather suspicious of the nature of certain elements of our public sector and those who are employed in the public sector. And frankly, I think they need a kick up the backside. Am I allowed to say that on an Acton podcast?
Sure. Yeah. When you say it with that accent, it just sounds inherently better. So let me think about it this way though too, because it's interesting when we have the work from home, and like you said, we've had the privilege of being flexible. I mean, I'm a beneficiary of that. I've had some, neck and spine issues over the last few months, where I've had to, work from home a little bit, and I don't think it's a HIPAA violation to say, I'm talking about my own medical issues, but COVID taught me how to run a team. I manage a team here at Acton, right, and we have great interactions, but we're project-based. Yeah. And COVID really taught us all the tools, or gave us the tools. We have Zoom and, all the whole 9 yards. And so over the last few months, as I've had to overcome some hurdles medically, I've been able to carry on and manage and do well. And so I know there are obvious benefits. But on the flip side, like I think you mentioned it's more the oversight, or are the people actually doing the work? Is that your main concern?
Yes, it's that, and also there's two things. There's that. I mean, I'm in favour of all that flexibility, and of course, any decent employer will always respond to the needs of their employees.
Yeah.
I think there are two things. Firstly, it's the oversight, but secondly, it's also the creativity. Where do ideas come from? Yeah. And ideas come from engagement with people, the chatting that goes on. And I suppose the other thing was that mentoring and training. Two of my sons-in-law are both senior accountants. I'm afraid it runs a bit in the family. The conversation around our table can get really interesting.
I'm sure.
Post-balance sheet events
and
accruals.
Those are hot topics.
And they would say one of their prime responsibilities is training the new folk coming in to the firms. And they can't do that other than being with them and being one-to-one.
Yeah, and Marshall McLuhan, media ecology, taught us that the medium is the message, or and some people argue that that's a positive or negative or a moral claim, but I think what a lot of people miss in that is that it's simply different.
Exactly.
I mean, whether or not it's a huge drawn-out discussion, a very interesting discipline, but the idea that people think that face-to-face communication is exactly the same if you do it on Zoom, it's just false.
Absolutely. And there are many advantages with Zoom. I've used them to run events with my own centre, which I couldn't have done other than that.
Yeah.
But, we had our first in-person event about 2 months ago.
Okay.
In 3 years.
Yeah.
Our first in-person event. And the first thing I said to the people who were gathered, maybe 30 people, isn't it marvellous that we're back together again? That buzz in that room. And that chorus of approval was, yes, we want to engage with these ideas with one another around the table.
Right. Yeah, those are really unique. And it's a strange time, too, because you had this unprecedented outlay, at least in my generation and probably two generations, of money, of the printing of money and the stimulus packages and the things attached to the governmental relief packages. And now we're dealing with some major I mean, the R word, is being thrown around. Are we going to enter a recession? And particularly in America, but it usually where we go, the world goes at times. So is this recession around the corner? But so when I read this, I get whiplash because last year American philanthropy hit a record of $471 billion given. And this is private. This is private philanthropy. And so that is coming up against the non-discretionary or discretionary spending of the American government outside of military spending. Yeah. That it rivals that number. And so there is still wealth, and some people argue, it's the numbers are interesting. Are the rich getting richer? This kind of conversation. Are those the same kind of conversations in the UK?
They are. And interestingly, let me just tell you briefly about this event we held. Our Centre for Enterprise Markets and Ethics, it was an event built around the morality of government debt. Now, the reason we held that event was government debt has mushroomed, perhaps for reasons we understand through COVID. I mean, I think probably whichever side of the economic arguments you want, you probably accepted there was going to have to be some support and government spending, to get through something we really knew nothing about. Yep. But nobody is now asking the question of, well, what is the moral case for continuing to accumulate large amounts of government debt? Because primarily all government debt does, I mean, you and I can have the benefit of the spending, but our children have to pay for it. Mm-hmm. And people aren't asking that sort of intergenerational question. And if you think of inflation as well, it's sort of spawned inflation, all of this printing of money and saving of money, printing of money and spending of money. And inflation is a highly destructive force. And from a moral perspective, you have to ask about that. And a lot of people have not experienced inflation at anything like the levels we're seeing now in both the UK and the US. Well, I remember from my 20s when inflation was 25% in the UK and the value of money was being destroyed. And again, a moral principle, let's get back to understanding the value of money.
Well, I was talking to a friend just last week, and he said, he laughed. He's several generations older than I am, and he mentioned, I was talking interest rates, and he was, what's the interest rate on your house? And we talked about it, and he was like, I remember my first interest rate was 18.5%.
Yeah.
And, we're complaining about, it's getting to 5.5, 6.
Exactly. Yeah. Of course, 18.5% is wonderful if you're the saver.
Right.
And not so good if you're the borrower.
Right. Yeah, that full circle back to the original topic. But the inflation, it's virtually stalled America's real estate market, which on one level I would argue our real estate market was artificially hot.
I mean, this is exactly the same as the UK.
Is it?
So we're just heading into a stall in the real estate market. But actually, there probably did need to be some form of correction.
Yes. We're of the same mind.
Even though I've benefited from that real asset inflation, there's a reality of I'm not sure this is a really good thing.
Yeah.
So we're just at that same nexus as you are in the US.
So a friend of mine just sold their house last weekend here in the greater suburbs of Grand Rapids, and the house. It was a great house, great family house, and a young couple purchased it. Well, they had, I think he said they had lost bids on 10 other houses.
Wow.
And so they went to their parents and said, would you buy it for cash?
Yeah.
We're competing against all cash. Yeah. Even though they had great credit, they had, they could purchase a home, the all cash, just the quick closing, et cetera. Yeah. And so their parents ponied up money, and then they wrote the offer in such a way. They had almost 40 offers on the house in 48 hours.
Wow.
And then it went for tens of thousands of dollars above
the asking price. Yeah.
And this couple, so it's almost irregardless of markets.
Yes.
Like the market doesn't, it almost doesn't even play in They just want to move here.
It's a really interesting story because exactly the same in the UK, and it has enormous implications because what we're finding is young people being squeezed out of the housing market for all the reasons that you just described, so that the average age at which a person acquires their own house is going up and up and up and up and is now in their mid-30s now. If you want a society that is aspirational, if you want a society that is effectively a property-owning democracy, and those were the principles that brought Margaret Thatcher to power in 1979 for more than 10 years. I mean, probably our greatest prime minister since the Second World War. It was because she understood the importance of access to the housing market for young people, for the aspirations of young people, and a property-owning democracy. And if that is under threat now, we threaten actually the whole concept of our society and the whole concept of a sort of like I said, a property-owning democracy.
And it builds in a fragmentation because you can't build strong families.
Exactly. And you end up with alienation and instability, and you end up with the door being opened for the sort of the socialism as the easy answer.
Yeah, it seems like we're in a lot of the same economic settings. So I am absolutely fascinated by your study. What are some things you're seeing in the future, maybe either for the UK or just broader implications for the Center of Enterprise Markets and Ethics? Where is there a hope? Are you studying a certain kind of thing, or where do you hope to take the center in the near future?
Well, here's one big thing. There may be other ththings, but here's one big thing that is actually bubbling at the moment, and it kind of builds on some of the things we've been talking about. We've just undertaken, at great cost, a professional, massive survey of opinion around markets and values. And we're about to publish the results. It was UK-based and it was aimed at the UK market. And the big thing we've discovered is loss of confidence in the market. Therefore, the big task that we have to do is re-articulate and re-win afresh the argument for a market economy going forward. And I think people assume, and you cannot assume. We've seen in this survey a loss of confidence in the market, even among business.
Are there one or two nuggets that you could, is there a reason? I'm sure it's multivariate, but are there?
So two things. Two nuggets, if you like. One is the complete loss of confidence in the market. Well, maybe that's too strong to say complete loss of confidence, but the loss of confidence in the market among business leaders, particularly the leaders of large businesses, where we found high percentages believing that business should be taxed more and that executives were paid too much. And you kind of think, well, if they don't really believe in what they're doing, what hope is there for the future? The other one was a massive divide between churchgoers and church leaders. And churchgoers, if you like, Christian people, going week in, week out, having a much more positive view of the role of business, the attractiveness of business, the much more positive view of the need for a low-tax economy, whereas church leaders, it was all wokeism. High tax, political campaigns from business, publishing pay ratios, et cetera, et cetera. So those were the two big things. Some loss of confidence in the market from business leaders and this divide between church leaders and churchgoers. So we have to win the argument again.
Yeah. Will that be, you said you're about to publish that? Will that become publicly available?
Yes, it will be publicly available. And literally we're about to send it to the printers. But,
love it.
We're just at the final proofreading, basically.
Okay. Well, I can't wait to see more when you, will you have follow-on programming at all about that? Or
we will have follow-on programming. Good. And we will have some follow-up work that we will do going forward.
I'm sure that'll help set the rudder a little bit for the near future.
Absolutely. And it would be interesting to think about how it relates to the US as well.
Yeah.
Having done it in the UK, what would be the outlook in the US? I don't know the answer to my question. It was just it would be interesting to think about.
Yeah, there are a lot of organizations, undertaking. I know there's a group at Duke Divinity School that have done some of that work recently on, enterprise. What does it look like to bring enterprise back into the conversation? And So there's good work being done, but I think there's a lot more to do. And it's such a pleasure to hear what's going on there in the UK and your participation with many organizations here. So thanks again for joining us. And we look forward to many years of engaging on these topics with you.
Thank you, Dad.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.